Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining me today. You're likely wondering, what's the Beambox 6th edition mapping diagram? Why is it important? How can it help you to understand PMBOK? What's all this about process groups and knowledge areas? Well, that's what I'm here for. We'll explore all these questions, so by the end of the session, everything will make sense to you. As you might know, PMBOK 6 has a stronger focus on Agile this time. There's plenty of information out there about Agile. So in this presentation, we're just going to focus on the mapping diagram and the processes. We'll have another session talking about Agile to make this concept easy for you. This is Majid. I'm your host today. I'm PMP certified and I have a few other qualifications that you can see here. In the future, I will be doing sessions on these as well. I'm CEO of FIA, and if you'd like to know more about our company, you can visit our website. You also have my email and phone here, so don't be afraid to get in touch if you have any questions. So, here's the mapping diagram. I created this based on PMBOK 6 and the latest corrections from BMI. You can find the corrections on the BMI website on the errata sheets page. Actually, there are additional corrections not mentioned on the BMI website regarding the PMBOK. So, if you are planning to study for the PMP exam, or even if you are a PMP instructor, I recommend you download the mapping diagram and the complete PMBOK 6th edition feedback from our website yapro.com under the project management section. You will find a high-resolution PDF file for the mapping diagram, which will help you to follow the links between the processes. This diagram contains detailed elements for each process. I recommend you use this diagram as your reference when you study for the PMP exam and also as a reference for managing your projects, which is what I do in my projects. Okay, before we talk about the processes, let's talk a little bit about the knowledge areas and the process groups in more detail. You can find this table on page 25 in the BIM book, but here it's colored to match the mapping diagram. Now let's take a look at this table. In order to make things manageable, PMI breaks up project management into process groups and knowledge areas. Knowledge areas have components which are processes, practices, inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. We use these to describe each knowledge area. Altogether, we have 10 knowledge areas. They are project integration management, project scope management, schedule, cost, quality, resource management, communications, risk, procurement, and stakeholder management. Each process in the knowledge area falls into one of the 5 process groups, which are initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. In fact, all projects, no matter how big or small, break down into process groups. In real life, we manage the project by applying and integrating all the processes as needed. This allows us to successfully achieve the project objectives. If you look at the PMBOK 6th edition, you will see it's got around 750 pages. That's a little bit intimidating when you have to learn so much. That's why, to make it easier to learn, I've combined all the process groups and the knowledge areas into one diagram. This diagram will help you to understand the process groups and the knowledge areas and will help you to understand and remember how they interact. As I'm sure you know, we have 49 processes in this version, so please note that this diagram doesn't represent any specific order or sequence because the processes may overlap or intersect, as you will see in a minute. Now, let's get to grips with these processes a little bit more. Each process has inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. The inputs are any documents which are key to the process, and they should come from an output from another process, unless they come from outside the project. We use the tools and techniques to turn the inputs into outputs, so the outputs should become inputs to another process unless the output is a terminal or final output. Project management processes are logically linked by the outputs they produce. This is a simple example showing you the inputs and outputs and their interactions. For instance, the first process from the integration knowledge area is the develop project charter process. The output from this is the project charter. This output will be used as an input to many other processes. For instance here, it's an input to the plan schedule management process, which is part of the project schedule knowledge area. The project charter is also an input to the plan cost management process, which is part of the project cost knowledge area. That means if you want to plan the schedule, you will need the project charter, and if you want to plan the cost, you will also need the project charter. Then, for instance, for the output from the plan cost management process, we will get the cost management plan. This plan will be a component of the whole project management plan, which is part of the integration knowledge area, where we integrate all the processes. Then the output from this will be the project management plan, and we'll use the components of the plan as inputs to all the processes in the diagram. For instance, as an input to the implement risk responses process, and so on for all the processes. Here, you need to understand the difference between the project lifecycle and the project management process groups. Both of these concepts are necessary for completing a project. The project lifecycle is what you need to do the work, and the project management process groups are what you need to manage the work. So, when you hear lifecycle, think doing, and when you hear process groups, think managing. You might hear people say initiating phase or planning phase and so on, but that's wrong. These are only groups of the 49 processes. A project phase is something else. A project can be divided into lots of different phases. In these phases, you will do the work you need to do to achieve the project objectives. So, in your project phase, you might do analysis. This would be the analysis phase. You could have a design phase, build phase, test phase, and so on, based on your project. Now, depending on the size of your project or phase, you might have all the process groups taking place in each phase. Remember that the process groups are mandatory for any project, regardless of size or type or complexity. That means every project has to start with initiating, then planning, and they should have executing and go back to planning. Meanwhile, they are monitoring and controlling, and so on until closing. But out of the 49 processes, some are optional, so you can tailor your project to avoid them as needed. But you can't avoid the planning or the executing or the monitoring and controlling of the processes you are executing, and you can't leave the project open forever, so you have to close it, even if the project has been terminated. So, now you have the general idea about the process groups, knowledge areas, and the project lifecycle or phases, and how it all works. By the way, there are many approaches for implementing the project phases and how they interact within the project lifecycle, but I will talk about them in detail in my full PMP course. Now let's go back to the mapping diagram and have a closer look at the processes we use to manage the project. The processes tell us who and what needs to be involved in responding to an event, or how people within the organization will work together to achieve the project goal. To simplify the PMBOK definition of a process, we can describe it as a set of interrelated actions and activities which we perform in order to create a specific product, service, or result. When you think about all the knowledge areas and the integration between them, don't think in sequential order. When you plan for a particular activity in your project, for instance, you can execute part of this activity while at the same time you may be closing another phase and monitoring and controlling something else. You might plan for communications, for example, and be managing the team at the same time, and so on. This is project management. Project management isn't something solid in which you have to do certain steps in order all the time, but also, in some cases, you need to do some actions in sequence. For instance, you don't want to execute anything before you've planned for it, because the planning for all the knowledge areas is guidance for you about how to do things right. Great! Now we'll introduce you to the 49 processes. In the diagram, each process has the same number as the chapter in the PM book, which is why the numbering starts at 4, since the first 3 chapters don't deal with the processes. We will start with the initiating process group. You begin by initiating your project, so you start researching and deciding what you're going to do to achieve your project. All you need to get your project started are these 2 processes. Right, let's start with the first process, which is part of the project integration management knowledge area. Now you can get started with your project. First, you will use the develop project charter process. It gives you, as the project manager, the authority you need to manage the project. So now you can sing happy birthday to your project. We have 2 outputs from this process, the project charter and assumption log. The project charter is like the birth certificate for your project, and we will use it as an input to many processes as we mentioned before. Remember, the project charter means the project has officially started and you're authorized to work in it. Next, you will move on to the Identify Stakeholders process, which is part of the project stakeholder management knowledge area. Stakeholder means anyone or any company or department that can affect the project or that can be affected by it. This process helps you to identify them and establish how you'll communicate with them. Now you can move on and start planning the scope, schedule, cost, etc. But don't forget, you might come back here. We're gonna do the planning process group now. Here we have 24 processes from all the knowledge areas. As it says in the title, this is where you do your planning. Always remember, planning is guidance for how you will act. No matter whether you are a PMP student, you are working in a project, or you are doing something else entirely. You will need to make a plan so you know what to do and when to do it. For instance, you want to drive your car, but you have to plan first by deciding where you'll go and how you'll get there, because without planning, you might end up in a different city. Imagine your wedding without planning. It's not gonna go well. You might have too much food or not enough. You might have too many chairs or too few chairs. If you don't plan for the cost of your wedding, maybe you will spend all your money, so you have none left for the honeymoon. Now, when you prepare to get your PMP, you need to imagine that you are working in a real-life large-scale project with a lot of project team members. So, when you are planning for the project, you need to document everything to guide you and the team on how to execute, monitor and control, and close the project or the phase. So for your project, you will work out what resources you have and what resources you need. You will also think about their cost and how you will schedule them. Within the planning process group, we start with the project scope management. You can see the scope management processes, which are colored blue. These are the first processes in the planning process group. They are what you need to make sure that the project includes all the work required and only the work required in order to complete the project successfully. Imagine you are working in a software company and you have been asked to build a website for a government department. But what will you do? What kind of website will you create? What services will it include? Do the services include taking payment, for example? What do you need to do to create this website? What work will you do? To answer all these and many other questions, you need to think about the scope of your website project. And this is why you need to think about how to manage the scope. To do this, we have 4 processes in the planning process group and another 2 processes which we will talk about later. The first one is plan scope management, where you plan all the work you will do to define your scope. You must plan in advance how you'll determine the scope of your project and how you'll manage and control it. As we said before, for all the processes, you will get outputs when you finish them. For this process, the scope management plan is one of the main outputs. We use this to document your plan for how you'll define, implement, monitor and control, and validate the project scope. Then, in the collect requirements process, you find out all the stakeholders' needs and requirements so you can meet the project objectives. You record them so you know what you're going to create and so they can be measured and tagged. Remember, you will speak to all the stakeholders involved in the project, not just the people who are assigned to work on it. So sometimes requirements gathering can take a pretty substantial amount of time, especially in big projects when you've got to get requirements from hundreds of people. So, now you've met the end users and the government employees and everyone who is interested in this website. Then you go through the define scope process. Now we are really beginning to get inside the project. When we are defining the scope, we are creating a detailed description of the project boundaries and the acceptance criteria. Also remember, not all the requirements you collected are included in the scope. So in this process, you will define what's included and what's excluded. And so, for the government website, you will include payment services, about us page, and complaints page, but you specify that you will only create 100 pages, no more, no less, and live chat is not included. Finally, in the planning process group, you create the work breakdown structure, or as it's famously called, WBS. This is a hierarchical structure representing the work needed for the project deliverables. In this case, the 100 pages for the website. Then you will subdivide the project work for these 100 pages into smaller components which are more manageable. This is an example of the WBS, so you know what it looks like when you see it. As you can see here, the first level is the final product of the project, and we can use the phases of the project lifecycle as the second level. The lowest level of each WBS component or element is called a work package. These represent the planned work. The benefit of the WBS is that you can easily break down the work into work packages, and the WBS shows where the work packages came from. Because of this, the WBS allows us to define the work related to the project objectives. Before we move to the next knowledge area, whether you are a PMP student or qualified project manager, it's really important that you understand how to build a WBS or work breakdown structure. It's one of the most important parts of the scope management knowledge area. Following scope management, we have the project schedule management knowledge area, for which the related processes are colored turquoise in the mapping diagram. As you know, a project is a temporary endeavor, so one of your project objectives is completing the project on time. This knowledge area includes the processes you'll need in order to do this. Now that you've created the WBS, you want to know how long each work package will take. As with all the knowledge areas, we begin with planning. Here, we are planning the schedule management, so we will define how and when to deliver the project. In plan schedule management, you will select the method you will use to manage the schedule. You will select the tools to use, and you will specify the units of measurement, like hours, days, weeks, and so on. Next is define activities. Just as we define the scope, Here we need to define the activities which we will do in order to produce what we need to deliver. When you created the WBS, you broke the work down into packages. Here we define the tasks and activities which have to be done to produce each package. Based on our website example, you have to produce 100 pages with many different services. So, for instance, the pages of the website are work packages. Here, the activities are the tasks you will do to create these pages. You will need to design each page. This is an activity. Creating code, it's activity. Design the database, and so on. All these are activities. Remember, we perform this process throughout the project. Then we have sequence activities, where you work out which activities needs to come before others. Then you will put them in the correct order and specify the relationships between these actions. At the end of this process, you will get the project schedule network diagrams. Here you can see an example. All the activities in any project should be connected to at least one other activity, so you can't leave any standalone activities. For people who work on software, it's like the relationships between database tables, with the difference between the logic and the attributes of the relationships between tables and the links between the activities here. Next is estimate activity durations. As a project manager, you always need to estimate your work and to make estimates for any actions before you take it. In this process, we estimate the number of work periods needed for each activity. In other words, how long each activity will take to complete. This needs an estimation of the amount of work effort and the amount of available resources required to complete the activity. Lastly, in the planning process group and in the schedule knowledge area, you have develop schedule. So, why is developing the schedule important? One reason is that some project sponsors and contractors don't have a realistic duration for the project. Imagine you are hired to finish the project in 1 year, but after you create the schedule, you find that actually it will take 1.5 years or 2 years or maybe less than 1 year. Estimating the duration for activities is not enough. Creating the network diagram also is not enough. Now you need to know how long your project will take. You need to develop the schedule using various tools. For instance, the critical path method or CPM, in order to have the full picture of which activities you must focus on or which activities have some flexibility, or as we call it, float. We use the CPM to work out the project schedule, and we can show the outputs using a Gantt chart or bar chart. Here you can see an example of the CPM. This project will take 19 days, as you can see. You have to know how to use the CPM in order to get the exact figure for the project duration. You can see the arrows which show the relationships between the processes. Yes, you start with the plan schedule, then define activities, then sequence them, etc. But also you repeat these processes all the time. All the processes are related to each other. You plan the schedule to create the first 20 pages in the website or first module, then you define the activities, but maybe you don't have all the activities for some work packages right now, so you shouldn't wait. You should continue working to sequence the activities you do have. Then maybe one of the team didn't give you an accurate estimation, or he needs longer to give it to you. So you continue and come back to the plan once you have more details, and so on. This is called progressive elaboration or rolling wave planning. You do this for all the processes in the whole project, not only for the schedule. Now we move on to the project cost management knowledge area. This includes all the processes you need so the project can be completed within the approved budget. In scope management, we created the WBS and we got 100 work packages for the website we want to deliver to the customer. Then we defined the activities we need to do in the schedule and we worked out the duration for them. Now we want to know how much they will cost. In cost management, we have 4 processes, 3 of which are in planning and 1 in monitoring and controlling. The first process is plan cost management. This gives you rules and direction on how the project costs will be managed throughout the project. As the project manager, when you plan for the costs, you have to consider the cost for the project life cycle and also after the project duration. That means the life cycle of the product you build, such as the maintenance, the operation, and the support costs. Unfortunately, some contractors and clients only think about the cost during the project, so they are looking for the cheapest way to deliver it, but they don't think about the cost after the project is finished. For instance, if our website example is hosted using an old operating system because it's cheaper, it will soon need to be moved to a newer one, which will cost more and won't actually save the customer any money. Now, after you put the guidelines in place for all the cost activities, you will need to estimate the costs for the activities in your project so you have an approximate measurement of how much money you will pay. Lastly, we have determined budget. By aggregating or adding together the estimated costs, you will be able to determine the cost baseline. When we define the budget, as project managers, we calculate the total cost, so we know how much money the company needs to have available for the project. The result of calculating the total cost of the project is the budget. We need to deliver any project to the customer within the agreed quality and grade. Let's look at the quality management knowledge area. There are three processes we do here in order to meet the customer's expectations. Here you undertake the first of them. In plan quality management, you will begin the process of planning the quality requirements and standards for the project. We need this process to make sure that we produce a quality product and get quality results. That means we are creating what we agreed to the standard we agreed. So, in our website project, we agreed with the customer that we would use an efficient database to make sure it can contain millions of records and retrieve the data within a few seconds. The standard for this website requires that we use the latest technology for payment. So, we have to make sure that we deliver this to the customer because this quality and the standard is what we agreed with them. Next, we have the project resource management knowledge area. In the old versions of PMBOK, they used to use the term project human resource management, but in this version, PMI changed this to include anything you use in the project which can help you to complete the project successfully, like labor resources, the team, or tangible resources like equipment, materials, etc. Here we have two processes. The first is plan resource management. This is where you plan how to estimate, acquire, manage, and utilize physical and team resources. Here you know if you can employ outsourced staff or if you have to use internal resources. You will figure out whether you can use the previous team or whether you need to make a partnership with a third-party company. Then we have estimate activity resources in which you estimate and quantify your resources. For instance, in our website project example, we need to use 5 programmers, 2 system analysts, 1 designer. Also, we need to use 1 SharePoint license and 2 SQL Server database license, etc. because these are resources too. Now, we move on to project communications management. Most project managers spend about 90% of their time communicating, so you can understand just how important it is. Sending emails, preparing reports, talking to stakeholders, workshops, meetings, etc. All these are communications and you need to plan them. So in plan communications management, you will define what kind of information you need to send, to whom and how, what format your team should use, and so on. If you don't have a good communications management system, you won't be able to run the project and complete it successfully. Let's look at the processes in the project risk management knowledge area. I selected orange for risk management because if I selected red, you would think that risk is always something bad or threatening. But when we are talking project management, we see risks differently. Here, risks are not only negative things, which we call threats, but risks can also be good things. These are opportunities. Risk management is used to maximize the probability and impact of positive risks and to minimize that of negative risks. In the planning process group, we have 5 processes, and as always, we start with the planning. In plan risk management, we put in place guidance and rules for the risks, and we will plan how to manage the other risk processes. Here you can see a simple template for the output from this process, which is the risk management plan. We define the methodologies, strategies, who will be responsible for the risks, funding and timing, and the risk appetite for each objective for the key stakeholders. This is because stakeholders have different risk appetites and thresholds. For instance, I might see something as negative, while you might see it as positive, or you may not consider it to be a risk at all. If you think about project delays, for me a delay for 1 week might be okay, but for others a delay for 2 weeks might be fine, so you need to plan for all this throughout the project. Also throughout the project, you need to identify the risks. If you read the mapping diagram, the output from this process is a document called Risk Register. You will use this document as an input to most of the processes, and you also update it throughout the project, because it's impossible to identify all the risks at the beginning of the project. Over time, the level of the project risk exposure changes. This is an example of the risk register you may use. You define each risk and link it with the WBS. Describe the causes, specify the risk owners, do the impact level analysis, and many other attributes as you can see here. Going back to our website project example, lack of team expertise is a risk, insufficient resources is a risk, learn a new technology is a positive risk, and so on. Now, after you've identified all the risks, the questions are, should you focus on all of them? Are some risks more important than others? Which risks do you have to focus on first? How do you measure the risks? To answer all these questions, you need 2 processes. First, perform qualitative risk analysis, then perform quantitative risk analysis. What's the difference between these 2 processes? Perform qualitative risk analysis is where you prioritize the risks and assess their probability of occurring and their impact on the project. We know from the name of this process that we analyze the risks subjectively, not numerically. So we evaluate the impact of the risks if they occur and figure out whether these risks are important or not. We also group the risks by category. The perform quantitative risk analysis process is where you assign values for the probability and impact of each risk. This analysis is only performed on risks which are marked for further analysis by the perform qualitative risk analysis process. Remember, the quantitative process can be optional. It's used based on the project complexity and size, so not in all projects. Let's use an example to understand the difference between these 2 processes more. Going back to our website project, you need to purchase a tool for it. And you have 2 choices: purchase from company A, which is cheaper but has very bad customer service, or purchase from company B, which is more expensive but has excellent customer service. For qualitative risk analysis, you will assess the various risks and their impacts from purchasing from each company. For quantitative risk analysis, you will assess numerically the chances that you will need customer support for the tool. You will look at how many people purchase a tool but don't need help, and how many purchase it but have problems requiring customer service support. Now these 2 processes lead you to the next process, which is plan risk responses. We use it to answer the question, what are we going to do about the risks we planned for, identified, and ranked? During this process, we decide on the strategies we will use for threats or opportunities, whether it's escalating, accepting, avoiding, enhancing, or any of the other options we have. In some projects, you need to buy things from outside, or you might need to make agreements and contracts with third-party companies to execute specific parts of the project. Perhaps you are a project manager on the buyer side, in which case the whole project will be implemented by a different company. This is why you need project procurement management. The first and the only process in planning is plan procurement management. Here you document your decision about buying a service from outside or building what you want using your team. For instance, for the website, if you want to build an online payment service, you can use your team to build it, but that will take 3 months and will cost $100,000. Alternatively, if you buy the service, it will cost $200,000, but it will save you time. This process is where you make your decision about whether you buy or build. Remember, we identify the stakeholders in the initiating process group. Now we need to plan their engagement in the project. The stakeholder management knowledge area is very close to communications management, because when you manage stakeholder engagement, you are communicating with them. Planned stakeholder engagement makes it possible for us to analyze stakeholder expectations and their impact in the project, so we can then develop appropriate strategies for managing the engagement of stakeholders in project decisions and execution. Okay, now we need to integrate all the previous processes in the planning process group. To do this, in the integration knowledge area, we develop the project management plan. This is the most important artifact in the entire PMBOK guide, because everything that happens in the project is guided by it. It's involved in all the knowledge areas. It has inputs from all the processes in the planning process group, and the only output from this process is the project management plan. The project management plan is defined as the document that describes how the project will be executed and monitored and controlled. We talked about the scope earlier, where we created the WBS, which is one of the scope baseline components. So now we need to integrate this with a schedule to create the activities. Also, we need to integrate the WBS with the cost to estimate the cost for each work package. And we also need to figure out what resources we need to use. After that, we need to integrate this with the procurement in case we need to buy equipment. And because we need to communicate the appropriate information to the appropriate stakeholders, so we need to integrate everything with everything else. As we said, there isn't a specific order for the processes you see in the diagram, and the process number doesn't mean that you have to do these processes in sequence. You might define the scope, then jump to estimate costs while you plan the project communications, and so on. Now let's talk about the executing process group. In the executing process group, we have 10 processes. Here we execute what we planned earlier. Let's start by looking at managed quality. This process is also known as quality assurance, which is what it used to be called in the previous versions of PMBOK. But using the term managed quality is broader than quality assurance. As you can see here, the output from your quality planning is used as an input to manage quality. This is the concept for all of the processes. In this process, you execute your quality plan and audit your work to make sure that project activities comply with the organizational and project policies, processes, and procedures in order to meet the quality objectives. It's the same idea here in the resource management knowledge area. We execute what we've already planned. In the executing process group, we have 3 processes. First, you will acquire resources. In plan resource management, we planned how to acquire the project team, how to obtain the equipment or the materials we need. Now that we're executing, we are going to actually hire the team or obtain the materials. Remember though, we hire the staff or obtain materials as we need them during the project. But as with everything, we always plan first. Then we have develop team. This process and the next process, which is manage team, are very close to the third chapter in PMBOK, the role of the project manager. You will see many similarities between them. After you acquire the team, you need to spend some time developing them, which is what this process is all about. You can do this in a few ways. For instance, you can improve the team competencies by improving the knowledge and skills of your team members. You also need to think about the overall team environment and, of course, spend time to motivate them and keep them motivated. The goal of all this effort is to enhance the project performance in order to meet the project's objectives. Now, you need to manage the team. Throughout the project, it's normal that you'll have to deal with conflicts between the team members, or some team members might change the scope or change their performance, and sometimes issues and problems appear in the team behavior. So, this process is to manage all that. During this process, the project manager's role is more as a leader than a manager. So he needs leadership skills, communication skills, and negotiating skills in order to create a high performance team. Then we have managed communications. Like we said before, 90% of the project manager's work is communications. The managed communications process makes sure that you collect, create, distribute, store, retrieve, manage, and monitor project information at the correct time and in the correct way. You'll also implement risk responses. This process is new in PMBOK. This is where you execute the strategies you agreed before during the risk response plan, if you remember, such as accept or enhance or mitigate. We do this in order to address the overall project risk exposure, minimize threats, and maximize opportunities, and so on. Next, we have conduct procurements. This is part of the procurement knowledge area. While you're planning the procurement, you decided to build the service or the equipment you need for the project or to buy it. So the output from planned procurement is make or buy decisions. If you decided to buy the service, you will need to send an RFP, request for proposal, to the vendors or sellers. You also establish your company's selection criteria before you select the best sellers. So far, everything we've talked about was done during planned procurements. In this process, conduct procurements, you'll get responses from the sellers, and you'll analyze their proposals and you'll select one. Then you can go forward and create an agreement with the selected sellers. Then we have managed stakeholder engagement. We planned stakeholder engagement during the planning, as you know. Say that we classify the stakeholders into various categories. For instance, the functional manager is unaware, two of the stakeholders are resistant, and the sponsor is supportive, etc. We also analyzed the impacts and discovered that some stakeholders have more impact in the project than others. We plan to use emails to communicate with the customers and to phone one of the stakeholders to discuss the progress or technical issues and so on. Now, while you're executing the project, some people's behavior will change and some people's impact will change too. You might find that the stakeholder who was resistant is now neutral or supportive, while another person who was leading the project at the beginning has changed and is resistant now. You figured out that for some people, communicating with them using emails is more effective than phone calls. Others, you need to meet them in person more often than you already planned to do. In this process, you work and communicate with your stakeholders to make sure you understand and meet their needs and expectations, and you address any issues they have, and that you make sure they are involved and engaged in the project. After all, you want your stakeholders to be interested and active, rather than disinterested and uninvolved. So, as we integrated the processes in the planning, we also need to integrate our work while we're executing the project. To do that, we have two processes in the integration management knowledge area, which are direct and manage project work and manage project knowledge. The direct and manage project work process is where you execute the planned deliverables. For example, in the website project, you plan to create an About Us page or to create content pages. So you created the WBS and you specify the deliverables or the work packages. In direct and managed project work, your team create this page, so they are implementing the work. Now you can see the page as a deliverable, but it's not ready yet to deliver to the customer because there are some processes you have to go through first, which we will talk about later. Throughout the project, any of the stakeholders can ask to change something in the scope, or there will be some correction or preventive actions which should be taken. These changes can impact the schedule, the budget, or the quality, for instance. So this process is also where you issue the change requests. Also, during the project execution, you will get data from the project performance. So this process is also where you issue the work performance data. Throughout the project, it's normal to face problems, conflicts between the team, issues with stakeholders. So this process is where you produce the issue log. Remember, all these outputs should be monitored and controlled. The other process you need is manage project knowledge. This is a new process in this version of the PMBOK. Throughout the project, you'll get knowledge, which can be things like the team's experience or know-how, maybe problems you solved, or challenges you faced, or it could be technical issues, techniques you used, or important information you obtained by the project. Maybe it's new skills your team learned, or best practices you followed, and so on. All these should be documented in the Lessons Learned Register document throughout the project, not only at the end of the project as most people think. We use the Lessons Learned Register as an input to many processes throughout the project, and of course it's constantly updated. Let's have a look at the monitoring and controlling process group. Monitoring and controlling contains 12 processes from all the knowledge areas. A very important part of being a project manager and managing a project is keeping an eye on everything that's happening in your project to make sure you can make adjustments as you need to. The processes in this group make sure that during the project you are monitoring and controlling so everything goes well. Let's start with the scope management processes. We've got two processes here. They are validate scope and control scope. The main idea in the validate scope process is to get formal acceptance of the project deliverables and get them signed off by the customer as they are completed during the project. But here, you might be confused about the formal acceptance and you will maybe say, don't we get the formal acceptance from the customer at the end of the project or at least at the end of each phase? Actually, the last process you will do will take place at the end of the project or at the end of the phase, and we call it close the project or phase. With validate scope, we are getting acceptance for the completed deliverables. But in close the project or phase, we are getting the final formal acceptance from the customer for the project or phase as a whole. For instance, in the website project, you will get each page signed off by the customer in validate scope. But when you get any phase or module completed, you'll get the customer to sign off on it in close phase. And of course, at the end of the project, you will get the whole website signed off in close project. So, don't be confused about the difference between these two processes. Now, we move on to control scope. If you want to measure or assess the work performance, you do it in the control scope process in order to manage the changes. This is the last process in the scope management knowledge area where you can monitor and manage the changes, comparing them with what we planned in the scope or the baseline during the project. So, as a project manager, you have to make sure that you react to the changes. Don't stop them. Otherwise, working on the project would be very difficult because the changes will happen anyway. But remember, gold plating, which means adding extras or adding something out of the scope, is not allowed. Sometimes you need to make changes. How do you do that? Well, any changes to the scope must be documented and evaluated first. And remember that changes to the scope are not allowed if you don't have an approved change request. We'll talk more about this when we come to perform integrated change control. So, control schedule is the same as control scope, since we compare what we planned with our actual progress and make sure that we're on time according to the planned schedule. Say we plan to finish a specific module within 1 month. Now that the work is underway, we will check whether the progress is the same as we planned or not. This is where we will use earned value analysis in order to get the real figure. Calculating the earned value makes it easy for you to know what you need to do with the resources you have. For example, imagine the performance of the team doesn't fit the original plan. In this case, you can decide to bring more people or to compress the schedule and accelerate the performance by doing more than one task at once. We call these concepts fast tracking and caching. In control costs, you also calculate the earned value to figure out what has been spent on the project so far with the planned budget. Like any control process, this process just means tracking the actual work according to the budget to see if any adjustments need to be made. You will use some formulas using earned value analysis or plan value, actual costs, variance analysis, formulas, and many others. What's the importance of using these formulas to calculate the progress and the cost? Well, imagine your manager asked you, "What's the progress of your project?" You can't say, "It's good." This is not enough. What if he asked you, "What's the schedule or cost performance percentage of the project so far?" This process answers these questions and more. Before we talk about the control quality process, let's go back a little bit to scope management. Before we validate the scope, we first conduct control quality on the deliverables, and then we validate them to get the acceptance from the customer. You control the quality. Based on what? It's based on the acceptance criteria which you specified before with the customer when you defined the scope. Here in control quality, you make sure that these deliverables are correct and completed, and they are meet the customer expectations based on what you specified before you meet the customer. In the previous two processes in the resource management knowledge area, develop team and manage team, we focus on the labor resources. Here in this process, control resources, we focus on the physical resources, such as equipment, materials, facilities, etc. The main concept of controlling these resources is to ensure that they are available as planned, and they will be released according to the plan, so at the right time, when they are no longer needed, and in the right amount. For instance, in a construction project, I will use 3 trucks. For the first month, I need all of them, and for the following month, I need only 1. Or maybe I need to move 2 trucks to a different location. The previous processes in monitoring and controlling have been focused on controlling, but now that we move on to communications, we are monitoring, not controlling. That's because you can't really control communications, you can only monitor them. When you're conducting monitor communications, you're ensuring that the communication requirements of both the project and the stakeholders are met correctly. Throughout the project, you and the project team send many emails and information about the project to the appropriate stakeholders. This process is ensuring that you send the right message with the right content or information as needed to the right person or audience through the right channel at the right time. Monitor risks. Here we check if our registered risks still exist or not, or if we have any new risks to add. We check whether the positive risks we already defined are still positive or if maybe some of them became negative. So we make sure our risk analysis and plan are still valid. The market and the technology change all the time, so we have to keep an eye on any environmental factors which can impact our project. For example, we planned to pay for one of the tools at a certain time. Then we discovered that the price is higher than we expected and planned for. Now this is a risk we have to take care of and which we have to monitor. In controlled procurement, we are inspecting the contractor's performance. Is the contractor doing well? Is there anything wrong we need to solve? Any changes or corrective actions we need to take? Are the contractor's buyer or seller following the plan to meet the project objectives, and so on? In this process, we manage any dispute with the contractors. Okay, the last process before we integrate all of them is monitor stakeholder engagement. It's monitoring the engagement, not controlling, because in some cases, as a project manager, you can't control the people who will be involved in the project. But you have to monitor them and update the stakeholder plan strategies based on that to keep them actively engaged. You have to use your influence on the stakeholders to keep them engaged effectively. This is one of the agile principles if you heard about it before. We now focus on teamwork with everyone involved, working together to deliver a successful project. Now, we need to integrate all the processes just as we did before. While you're working, you have to make sure that the project runs smoothly. Lastly, in the monitoring and controlling process group, within the integration knowledge area, we have two processes. First, monitor and control project work. When you are managing a project, your objective is getting the desired results within the agreed time frame, quality, budget, etc. To be able to succeed in that, as a project manager, you must always be aware of how the project is going. This process mainly aims to check if the project is progressing as planned or not. If you find any variance from what you planned, you need to submit a change request to get the project back on track. Which leads us to the next process, perform integrated change control. Some changes in the project can impact the scope, cost, schedule, quality, leading you to new risks, and so on. Once the project is baselined, change requests go through this process. Any changes in the project should be documented, reviewed, evaluated, analyzed, and checked for impacts. And finally, we have the closing process group. Here we ask, are the project's planned deliverables really done and completed? Is the work done based on the planned quality? Did you validate the deliverables? Did you get the acceptance from the customer on all of them? Are the lessons learned documented? Did you close the contracts with the sellers? If all of these are done, you can close the project or the phase you are in. You get the final acceptance from the customer, then you can release the team and the resources you used in the project so they can work in a different project. Then you provide the final report about the project and archive it for future projects. The close project or phase process is part of the integration knowledge area. This is the process of analyzing all the activities you did before. So, you are integrating the project from the start throughout the life cycle until closing. As the project manager, you are the one who combines the results and information from all the knowledge areas, and you have the overall view of the project. Remember that the integration management is the primary role of the project manager. I hope you've enjoyed the summary presentation about all the processes included in the mapping diagram for the PMBOK 6th edition. Again, this was Majid from IA. The IA team and I encourage you to get in touch with any inquiry. So please don't hesitate to contact us if you need any help with your PMP study or for any consultation in project management. Good luck to you for the future.